If you like this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon. For just $1 a month, your name can appear at the beginning of this and many other upcoming videos.
What just happened?
Holy crap, he evolved into a flying type! Well, this is certainly an episode that'll get people talking. The Mold Down is not only a Spike episode, but it's also a Spike episode that introduces a potential game-changing element, because now he has wings, and still relies on Twilight horseback. So, how did this episode fare out? Let's take a look. In this episode, Spike goes through the molding phase in a dragon's life, in which they grow witchy scales, have inconsistent fire belching, have no control over their vocal cords, and let out a bad smell that attracts predators. And as he goes about his day, he's forced to deal with all of these stages of dragon puberty. Yeah, they don't even try to hide how this episode is about puberty, which isn't very subtle. But it still makes for a good story as we get some very well done progression for Spike, as well as several other nice elements. Sakura finally gets an appearance in this season, and she plays a fairly active role in the story. The way the episode builds up to her appearance is done nicely. It's not until Spike exhausts all of his other options that he finally comes to the conclusion that he needs her help. He realizes this isn't a situation he can avoid, and his efforts to cope with it have interfered with his daily routine. And the episode as a whole has some genuinely good build-up. It introduces different phases of the mold step by step, and takes time to establish how it would interfere with Spike's day. We then have a scene explaining what Spike is going through and how he needs help in dealing with it. I should point out how this scene with Smolder is a really nice means of utilizing her character and distinguishing her personality. While she is there just for exposition, you get a good impression on her attitude and views due to how she interacts with Spike. She doesn't act prideful or selfish like a lot of other dragons, but she does act naive to Spike's point of view. She's a middle-of-the-road kind of dragon where she's noticeably cocky and a bit insensitive, but not so much that she makes fun of Spike's misfortune. She's simply being honest about the difficulties that come with molding. There's still the impression that she is more social and open-minded compared to most other dragons, given her experience in interacting with other species. The way she's edifying the molding process to Spike can be seen as tough love, which would make sense for her since she did grow up in a much more hardened environment. Her teasing comes across as genuine and harmless, and the way she responds to Spike's molding shows how she accepts it as natural and doesn't hold it against him. This is also the first time since the season began where one of the Student 6 is portrayed as a standalone character instead of functioning in a group, which makes the interaction have a uniqueness to it. And it helps Spike to understand his situation better since he's discussing it with another dragon. It's scenes like this where you see potential behind the Student 6, and it makes you want to see them be explored further. It was also very smart of the episode to state how the molding process and the greed-induced growth from Secret to My Excess are two completely different things. Without that, the episode would have come across as contradictory and make no sense, since we would have been forced to connect Spike's greed growth with the molding process, which would not only have gotten confusing, but also disregard continuity. The molding process feels much more natural as it comes across as a biological case, whereas the greed growth came across as artificial due to its effects being unrelated to Spike himself, and easily being reversed by the end of the episode. It would make sense that the greed growth was unnatural, seeing as how Spike didn't grow wings in that episode either. It's a reference to a past episode that feels poignant and meaningful and ties into the story, unlike the rest of the references to other episodes that just feel like they're there for the sake of being there. The molding process can also give us some insight on how harsh the upbringing of a dragon can be. We're told that the molding process happens to all dragons at some point, and when that happens, they're removed from their household and forced to fend off giant predators. If this is something that happens to dragons at Spike's age, how exactly have they been surviving this whole time? It could be that they had to harden their resolve in order to survive the molding process, which would help to explain their attitude problems. The way the rock eagle is introduced in this episode has a nice touch to it. Instead of just being a random animal that was made up for the episode, there's actually a lot of fun history behind it. Whatever the background you might be using, the rock is this mythological creature said to be a huge predator capable of hunting large mammals as big as an elephant. It adds conflict to the episode where it's needed, and it's nice to see the show is taking more inspiration from real-world mythology. Now, before I talk about Spike, I should note that there are a couple of issues with this episode, particularly with its humor. These two running jokes about Rarity's hearing and Spike's volume control become really irritating and overused. They both slow down the pacing of the story for an obvious joke with an obvious setup and an obvious punchline. It constantly relies on being loud, which makes it feel really grating and repetitive. Also, if phoenix feathers cause a deafening effect on ponies, why does Celestia have one as a pet? It's something that's never explained to us, and it ultimately has no impact on the story, so it just comes across as pointless information. There's also the issue of Rarity and Twilight appearing very abruptly in the middle of the climax. And I'm really getting tired of addressing this, but the show really needs to stop with the Sparity crap. For 8 seasons, this relationship has gone nowhere, and it's had no impactful effect on the characters. Spike's relationship with Rarity has always been at its best when it's conveyed to us as them being good friends instead of teasing a romantic one. You get better dialogue between the two, and it allows them to interact fairly instead of just making it look like Spike is giving himself into her, in which she takes advantage of him. At this point, it's obviously being done just to tease the shippers at the expense of the character growth. I think the show itself needs to address this in a way that actually has meaning to it. Even give it its own episode if they need to. Just have Rarity and Spike addressing the issue and have Spike explaining how he's grown out of his crush on her. So with that out of the way, let's talk about what this episode means for Spike himself. What makes this such a good Spike episode is how the situation is implemented into his character. As Spike continues to deal with the molding issue, it ends up boasting his fears of being forced to leave Twilight. And while this is the 5th or 6th time Spike has gone through this dilemma, it still makes sense. We've seen how his greatest fear is being abandoned by the pony who nurtured him since birth and raised him to feeling accepted in an environment separated from his own kind. He's placed in a sympathetic situation in which he has to confront this pubescent stage in his life and how it may affect his relationship with Twilight. Unlike several other Spike episodes, it's a conflict that isn't caused by his own actions, which helps it to come across as more natural. It's somewhat relatable, as it can reflect on older teenagers and young adults who are expected to live on their own at some point. He's starting to become more of a dragon, which makes him question his ability to live among ponies long term. There have been a couple of times where he felt like a fish out of water, and now that he has his wings, this realization hits him much harder than it normally does. Even though he's occasionally naive, what differentiates himself from most dragons is his well-natured personality and pure heart. And it's something that drives him to do what's best, not just for himself, but for those that he cares about. Additionally, giving him wings may not be a huge change, but it does have some potential and possible opportunities behind it. It's also a timing to the status quo that's different from most others. While most of the show's game-changing events happen at the beginning or the end of the season, this is something that happens in the middle of it. Aside from that, this is a major change for a major character. A moment of progression and important transition for him. While it's not one of the best Spike episodes, it's definitely one of the most important as he enters a new stage in his life. The only problem that would come from this is if Spike doesn't grow mentally. If the only growth that he has is a physical one, it really wouldn't mean much, as there's no actual growth to his character. So with all that said, the Mold Down is still a pretty good episode. While it's not as good as it could have been, there's definitely some good entertainment value to it. With some nice growth for Spike and some good character interactions, it's easily one of the most memorable of the season, and one that I look forward to seeing again soon. So until next time, take care of yourselves and stay awesome. This is Map signing out.